for having me here at the Bridgeville Historical Society. I haven't been here in a couple years. I was scheduled to talk last year, and I completely flaked out on you and canceled and asked Glenn Flickinger to come in, and he upstaged me and did a better talk than I had planned. So I'm very grateful to be back, and I'm grateful that you asked to hear about the Berlin Airlift, because it's a wonderful story. It's a wonderful part of our history, and it's also an important story. But before I get to it, I do want to let you know that although I spent many years teaching and writing history, right now I am the director of the Veterans Breakfast Club, which is a nonprofit that gets veterans together to share their stories. And we do it about 40 times a year, mostly in Western Pennsylvania. I'm going on the road to Philly next week, and then New Jersey the week after that to do breakfast there. But we just get veterans together with the public and have veterans share stories. We do it in person, we also do it online. So last night, every Monday night at 7 p.m., we have people from around the country join on Zoom, and we live stream it on YouTube and Facebook. We do it every Thursday night also at 7 p.m. We do travel. We're going to New Orleans next week with Pat and Jeff Hurd will be on that trip. 32 of us going to the World War II Museum. So we do a lot of really cool things, and we publish a magazine. And the magazine, this is our winter issue. You can see I have a bunch. We send out 11,000 of these to households around the country, mostly here in Western Pennsylvania. And then we print up another 8,000 and hand distribute them. And so they are stacked from floor to ceiling in my garage. My wife has a tough time getting out of the car. So please do take as many as you want, is what I'm saying. Our next issue is at the printer now. We're just going to focus on the fall of Saigon. April 30th is the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, which is the final end of the Vietnam War. And it turns out a lot of our veterans who are Vietnam veterans remember that day, even though they were back home, they were long back from the war, but they remember and shudder at the memory of Saigon falling and the whole effort that they've been a part of to save South Vietnam failing. And it's a failure that was echoed in August of 2021. And we get a lot of younger veterans who served in Afghanistan and served in Iraq, and they share that kind of bitterness with Vietnam veterans about how their war ended with the fall of Kabul in 2021. So we're doing an issue that's devoted to the fall of Saigon and to the fall of Kabul and our veterans' memories of that. But I'm here to talk about the Berlin Airlift. The Berlin Airlift. For 11 months, from June 1948 to May 1949, the British, the French, but especially the Americans, delivered all of the food, fuel, and medicine a city of 2 million people needed to survive. And they did it because West Berlin was blockaded by the Soviets. Nothing could go in or out except by air. It was an extraordinary effort. Most people thought it could not be done, but it was done. And it was one of the few real bright spots, I would say, for the Allies during the Cold War. It was one of the few unambiguous victories that the Allies had during the Cold War. It absolutely helped President Harry Truman win re-election in 1948. And it also marks such an important turning point in our history, because right up till the Berlin Airlift, there was some hope, dim as it may have been, that the Soviet Union, who remember was our ally, and our most important ally in World War II, that the Soviet Union would come around to being, if not an ally of the US, at least a non-hostile rival state. But that was not to be after the Berlin Airlift. After the Berlin Airlift, the Cold War got really hot and bloody and perilous in a way that it had not been before. So the Cold War is kind of, if you picture the Cold War as a 3-act play, the Berlin Airlift is the end of the first act. And after the airlift, it's a whole different world, really. The airlift was the product of a decision that the United States made and the Allies made to change their plan for how they were going to handle Germany after the war. The original plan for Germany after World War II was to strip it of all its industrial value, demilitarize it completely, and restore it to an agricultural and pastoral nation. It was called the Morgenthau Plan. The Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, had devised it and published a book on it, and had kind of, in a sense, he had kind of foisted it upon Franklin Roosevelt and the Allies just adopted it, the Morgenthau Plan. That the plan was, again, to split Germany into two parts, North Germany and South Germany, split off all the wealthy industrial parts of it, cede it to other countries like Poland on the one hand or Belgium on the other, and put the Ruhr Valley in an international kind of protectorate. And it was quite a severe plan, and it had some critics. And some of the critics were Cordell Hull, who was Secretary of State under FDR, and also that guy up there, Henry Stimson, who was Secretary of War. They didn't like the Morgenthau Plan, and during the war they quietly urged FDR to abandon it. And they urged him to abandon it for a few reasons. Number one, just a basic human decency reason. You know, farms and sheep in Germany could support maybe a population of 30 million people. The problem was Germany had a population of 65 million people. And if you were to ask Morgenthau, what's going to happen to the other 35 million? He would say, they'll have to go away. There was a real concern, like, are we going to have a humanitarian disaster on our hands in Germany when Germany is not able to feed itself after the war? During the war also, and I didn't put this up on the screen, but it was a real issue. During the war, Adolf Hitler used the Morgenthau Plan to boost the morale or encourage the fighting spirit of the German people, saying, you know, if we lose this war, we're going to be reduced to nothing. We're going to be killed. So fight to the death. Don't surrender. And the Allies were picking up that this was not good. If we were looking to get German soldiers to surrender, we had to promise them some kind of future, you know. There was also the economic critique, which ended up being extremely important. Germany historically has been the industrial powerhouse of Europe. You're not going to have a prosperous Europe without a prosperous Germany. I love this example. France was the biggest supporter of the Morgenthau Plan because, you know, this is France. They had been invaded twice by Germany, devastated, conquered by Germany. They never wanted to see a powerful Germany again, and they were fully on board with the Morgenthau Plan until after the war, when they realized their economy was never going to recover from the war, the French economy, without a strong Germany as a trading partner. So there needed to be some kind of German state. And then finally, by 1947, there's a realization dawning on Americans generally, President Truman in particular, that the Soviet Union is a problem, a big problem. That they're not going to stay within the boundaries of the Soviet Union. They're going to look to expand their grasp, to expand their power into Central Europe and maybe even Western Europe. And that if we have any hope of, and this is the term that was used at the time, any hope of containing Soviet communism, containing communism in the borders where it existed, we needed some kind of strong, prosperous economy and state in the middle of the continent, and that was Germany. So Germany needed to be rebuilt. Germany needed to be strengthened. And in 1947, the Allies and the Truman administration made the decision, we are not going to turn Germany into pasturage. We're going to try and rebuild it. The problem is, the United States didn't control Germany. It only controlled a part of Germany because Germany had been split up, as you know, after World War II. It had been split up into 4 or even more sectors. In the East, the largely agricultural and poorer Eastern sector, East Germany, was under occupation by the Soviet Union, there in the red. The British sector was northwest Germany. The American sector was southwest Germany. And then the French sector, which was also split somewhat with, I think, Belgium and Luxembourg, controlled the most southwestern part. I used to teach the Cold War in college, and it took some time to explain how countries got split apart, or as it was called then, partitioned, into different parts and different occupation zones. These were not meant to be permanent national divisions whatsoever. There was always the intent that after, in due time, the parts would be re-merged together and Germany would be reunited. What always confused my students, however, and I had to take a long time to explain it, is that Berlin itself, the old capital of Germany, itself was split into 4 different sectors. Even though Berlin was a city entirely surrounded by East Germany, entirely surrounded by the Soviet zone, the city itself was considered so important that it was split into 4 different zones. Berlin, there was East Berlin, controlled by the Soviets, and there was West Berlin, split among the Western Allies. So this is a city, the western part was a city of 2 million people, about the same number in the eastern part. And again, these were not permanent political divisions. There was movement among the sectors. The sectors had a common currency for a while. And there was just a plan to reunite Berlin along with Germany sometime in the future. This had been agreed upon at a meeting of the Big Three, that is, the leaders of Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States, at Potsdam, which was a suburb of Berlin, in the summer of 1945. This was an agreement that Germany, at the end of the war, would be split into these temporary occupation zones. And it's surprising, we know now, since the fall of the Soviet Union and access to Soviet records, we know now why Stalin was surprisingly relaxed about Germany, about the partition of Germany. Surprisingly generous to the Allies. Oh, you want the Western sector? Yeah, you can have the Western sector, said Stalin, no problem. At the very end of Potsdam, the American negotiators, and this for a long time was very much of a mystery, the American negotiators came in and said, we actually want part of Berlin also. And Stalin forced the Allies to trade part of the other occupation zones that the Americans had control of, but was willing to hand over West Berlin. And there was some, why did the Americans at the 11th hour in these Potsdam negotiations want West Berlin? The best guess is that we wanted spies there to spy on the Soviets. And there were also some German engineers and scientists in hiding in Berlin, and we wanted to make sure that we were able to grab them if we could before the Soviets grabbed them. And Stalin was pretty relaxed. There's Stalin, you see right there, pretty relaxed about it, because he knew, and he was absolutely right, that Americans are impatient, they have a short attention span, and they want their boys to come home. The Americans don't do long occupations. We tried it at the end of the Civil War. It didn't work out so well. We didn't even try it at the end of World War I. All the boys were home in 1919. FDR had said publicly many times that the longest any American troops will stay in Europe after World War II will be 2 years. That's it. So all Stalin had to do was wait. Would leave, and he could take all of Germany. That's all he had to do, and it sure looked like that was what was going to happen. Stalin had 1.5 million to 2 million troops stationed on the ground in East Germany. 1.5 million to 2 million. The Americans had 100,000. There were maybe 10,000 U.S. soldiers in West Berlin. And there was at least another million or so in reserve just east of Germany that the Soviets had. So the Red Army was sitting there waiting for the Allies to leave and then the Red Army would be able to take the more industrialized, the more advanced western sector of Germany. That was the plan. So, even though the US didn't control all of Germany, they knew that the first step to kind of reviving the German economy, which was in ruins after World War II, was to introduce a new currency based on the US dollar. The Soviets had continued the use of the old currency, the Reichsmark. This was the currency created by Adolf Hitler. In fact, there's a Reichsmark right there. That picture is the picture of a Hitler Youth. Coinage circulated in Germany with the swastika on it. This was just the money that had been used during the Nazi era. And the Soviets deliberately inflated the currency. There was great inflation in Germany after World War II. Not quite to the extreme extent of after World War I, but it was still, very high inflation, to the point where the few goods that circulated in Germany, the few goods that were in stock in Germany after World War II were back in the stock room and not put on shelves. Because a funny thing happens, and I think we've learned this in the past couple years, a funny thing happens when inflation goes on the rise, especially if it rises rapidly. Shopkeepers hold back their stock because they know if it goes off the shelves now, the money that they get for it is going to be worth less in the near future. So they hold it back. They just put on their shelves just enough to keep their business going until inflation can get under control. The US was determined to bring inflation under control. And so in June 1948, the US announced that it was going to introduce into Germany a new rival currency that the German people could hand in and get at their banks on par for a Reichsmark. It would be called the Deutschmark. It would be backed by the US dollar, which was as good as gold. That meant that you could actually take a Deutschmark and exchange it for a US dollar, which was the world's, currency at the time. So this was a clear threat to the Soviets. The Soviets protested and said, we will not allow the Deutschmarks to be brought into East Berlin or East Germany. And they started searching parcels and shipments that were going into the eastern section of the city. But it was too late because the Americans had made the announcement after they had already secretly shipped the Deutschmarks to the banks. So on June 21st, 1948, the banks opened with Deutschmarks available, and people absolutely flooded these banks and exchanged their Reichsmarks for Deutschmarks. And wouldn't you know, in stores throughout Berlin, suddenly the shelves were all full. This was a really important first step to bringing a prosperous Germany back on its feet. And you have to remember, and I think I should emphasize this, that communism flourishes best when people are hungry. Communism feeds off of human misery. And historically that has been true. Whenever you have a country on its knees, like France after World War II, you have the rise in popularity of the Communist Party that's offering not necessarily a bright future, but food and shelter and clothing and maybe some health care. Some of the basic necessities of life. You have to, of course, give up a lot of your freedom and individual liberty in exchange for that security. But that's the bargain most people, or many people, are willing to make when they can't eat, when they're starving to death. And so it was in the Soviets' best interest to keep Germany poor. And the introduction of the Deutschmark was a threat to that effort. And so in response to the Deutschmark, direct response, Stalin declared a blockade of Berlin, West Berlin. And it was very simple. Soviet Red Army soldiers would be stationed around West Berlin and would not allow any rail road or barge traffic in. That's it. This is a city of 2 million people. It had 36 days worth of food left, 45 days worth of coal, and there was no way for the city to receive any of those supplies after the blockade. What was the U.S. to do? How was the U.S. going to respond to this? I have to remind you, and I want to let you know, and I'm sorry that I have to embarrass him like this, we have somebody who was 13 years old in Berlin during the Berlin Airlift. This is Bernd Stoy. 10 Reichsmark for 1 Deutschmark.
Yeah.
You remember that?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So this memory is burned in his mind, and I'm going to have him critique my talk. What I got wrong, or maybe what I got right, and hear what he remembers of that time. And you know, I have to say, and again, I don't want to embarrass Bernd too much, but I asked him, just met him before this talk, and I asked him a little bit about what he remembers of World War II. And the look he got on his face, I'll never forget. He just said, we don't talk about that. You know, we don't talk about that. And I have only a faint idea of what he must have endured as a child during the war, but also what he must have gone through after the war when Berlin was in rubble. It was destroyed. It was flattened. I mean, there wasn't a building standing in the city. I remember reading, you know, this Potsdam meeting. There was a meeting in Potsdam. Why did they have to meet in Potsdam, a distant suburb of Berlin? Because there was not literally a building standing in Berlin that the Allies could meet in after the war. People were living in the rubble. They were living in basements. There was no running water. There was no electricity. There were no jobs. There was no police force. People made their living just rummaging through the rubble, looking for anything they might be able to trade, you know, or sell. These are some horrifying pictures of post-war Berlin. And there was no plan to make it better. There is a bad series I do not recommend you watch on Netflix called The Defeated. It features a New York cop who goes to Berlin to solve some mysteries. But the one thing I liked about it was the opening scenes of the first episode when they used computer graphic, what is it, CGI, computer-generated imagery, to recreate Berlin the way it was after the war. And they used archival photographs and recreated them with more detail. So you can imagine this series kind of opening up with a loud moaning sound in the background on this city that's utterly devastated. And they take scenes like little vignettes from archival photographs and again recreate them on the set like this and like this. And there's a cop on the right. He's from Brooklyn, but somehow he speaks with a New England accent. I don't quite understand it. And he arrives and he has a map of Berlin. And he's looking for the police station in Berlin. And so he meets this woman who's picking through rubble. And he says he's looking for the police station. Is it Ritterstrasse? Where is Ritterstrasse? And she points over there and says, you know, it's over there, but that map isn't going to help you. And he says, why? And she said, because there are no streets there. And that's, I've talked to people, and I'll be curious to hear what Bernd says. I've talked to people who literally said, during some of these bombing raids at the end of the war, it wasn't just that buildings were damaged or buildings collapsed. It was entire blocks were obliterated so that you could no longer see the street. You could no longer distinguish among the streets of the neighborhood. It was that kind of devastated. So Berlin is on its back. Berlin is going to die. People in Berlin were living on less than 1,600 calories a day. That was the estimate. Just not even quite enough to keep you alive. Not quite enough to keep you alive. People were dying in large numbers. And Harry Truman was facing a humanitarian catastrophe at the center of Europe. What's he going to do about this? What's he going to do about the blockade? And his advisors sang like a chorus and told him, Give up. Give the Soviets West Berlin. That's the only way these poor people are going to survive. What else are you going to do? What are you going to do? You're going to go to war with the Soviet Union? They have 10 times the number of troops you have on the ground. What do you have that the Soviets don't have? Truman would mention the bomb. There was one other bomb. And Truman deliberately did move B-29s to England, 10 B-29s to England, to make the Soviets think that we had 10 bombs, but those B-29s were empty. There was nothing. You could try and negotiate with Stalin. What kind of bargaining chip do you have in this negotiation? No, his advisors, and it was perfectly reasonable advice. I don't want you to think it wasn't. It's probably what I would have suggested. I think it's what most of us would have suggested. Let it go. Let it go. This confrontation with the Soviet Union is big, it's global, it's long-term. Berlin is a tiny battlefield in this larger war. Let it go. Make the strategic decision to allow these 2 million people to live under communist Soviet occupation. Abandon West Berlin. That was the sensible advice, because what else are you going to do? There's no other option. Truman, however, was stubborn. He was, he was smart, very smart. And he was determined. And he wrote in his diary, like, we're not going to leave West Berlin. We'll stay in Berlin, come what may, he wrote. One person suggested that he fight for West Berlin. And that was this man who was the military governor of occupied Germany, Lucius Clay. Lucius Clay was a 4-star general. He had been a kind of a desk jockey in World War II. And he alone told Truman, it's critical that we fight for West Berlin. It's critical that we be seen as fighting for West Berlin. He said, there is no practicability. He was not a good speaker. There was no practicability, which I don't think is a word, in maintaining our position in Berlin. But it must not be evaluated on that basis. We are convinced that our remaining in Berlin is essential to our prestige. There we go. We're convinced that remaining in Berlin is essential to our prestige in Germany and in Europe. Whether for good or bad, it has become a symbol of the American intent. So his advisors were telling him Berlin has no strategic value, and it didn't. But Clay says it has symbolic value. It's going to mean a lot, not only to the people of Germany, but to all of Europe. What is the U.S. willing to put up in this confrontation with the Soviet Union? Will the U.S. fight for Europe and fight for Europe's future? The world and Europe is looking at how you're going to respond to this crisis in West Berlin. You've got to do something. Now, the advice that Lucius Clay gave was really bad. He said, yeah, what you got to do is take a couple of American Army divisions and just like ram them through the roadblock with supplies into West Berlin. And Truman said, like, well, how do they get out? And how do we get more in? I mean, that will keep them alive for another month, but it's not a solution. No American advisor ever suggested to Truman an airlift. It was a British idea. The British, who apparently read the agreement, signed at Potsdam, saw that there was a clause. And the clause was that no party in Germany would ever be allowed to interfere with the air rights in and out of Berlin. So the air rights were there. The British and the Allies and the Americans had the ability to fly. The air could not be blockaded. And the guess was, the British guess was that Stalin wouldn't dare to shoot planes out of the sky. It's one thing to turn boats around and trains around and trucks around. It's another to shoot a plane, a cargo plane, with medicine for children out of the air. Stalin would not do that. The British even came up with this great list, and this is a list of what a city of 2 million people needed to survive. They needed 4,500 tons of supplies a day to deliver 1,990 calories per person to 2 million people. And here's a list. 646 tons of flour and wheat, 125 tons of cereal, 24 tons of fat. You go on down there's a lot of 3 tons of yeast for baking. Germans, they like to bake, but they need their yeast. A lot of cheese and a heck of a lot of coal and gasoline. So if you could get 4,500 tons a day, you could keep the city of West Berlin alive. That was the idea, by air. The problem was we didn't really have the planes. During the war, we did have the planes. 70,000 of them was the largest air force by far in the world. But the war had ended. Those planes had been mothballed or in boneyards, mostly in Arizona. We were now down to about 20,000 airplanes. And the planes that we needed, cargo planes like this, were very few. Europe had about 100 of them. We had about 100 C-47s, Goody Birds, in Europe. These planes had a 3.5-ton cargo capacity. There were about 100 there, and that's all we had. You could fly these 100 planes round the clock to supply 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to try and supply West Berlin. You're still not going to get to 4,500 tons of supplies. You can't do it. But it's with these 100 planes, 104 planes, 102 planes to be exact, that the airlift began. Truman decided we're going to try it. And it started out very modest. As you can see, the first flight on June 25th, 1948 was 80 tons of milk, flour, and medicine. That was it in C-47s. A tiny fraction of what was needed to keep the city alive. But it was a start. The British pitched in, and even the French pitched in a bit. What was needed, his advisors told him, were bigger cargo planes. And there was a bigger, newer cargo plane called the C-54, the Skymaster, but there were none in Europe. They were all in Asia. And so the Army, Lucius Clay, politely requested of the Air Force, could we borrow some of your C-54s for this airlift in Europe? And the Air Force said, we'll get back to you on that. They came back to them, and guess what they said? No. No. Screw you, Air Army. You get everything all the time. We're going to keep our planes. You do the best you can. I mean, the inter-service rivalry, as you know, among the service branches, Navy, you're the worst. It can get pretty fierce. Truman had to speak up. Truman, and this became very public. This was a public feud. Truman had to step in and order the Air Force to move C-54s to Europe for the airlift. And this was public, so this meant now that Truman owned the airlift. It was his. He had kind of stuck his neck out. He was going to try this crazy thing that his advisor said wouldn't work. And the Republicans opposed it. And they opposed it for good reason. 2 big reasons the Republicans opposed it. Number 1, it wouldn't work. Number 2, it wouldn't work and it would be extremely expensive. And they were right on the second count. It was extremely expensive. Most experts said that it wouldn't work. So this became Truman's baby, and he did it against a lot of his expert advice. By July and August, the airlift gets systematized. There are 2 corridors going in to West Berlin, one from the British sector in the north, one from the American sector in the south, from air bases in the north and in the south, in the southwest of Germany, and then a single return corridor that would return to the British sector, and then from there, the planes would return to the American sector. The British pitched in these Sunderland flying boats. These are airplanes that can land on water, and these were great because water corroded. These were, I think, salt was carried in the Sunderland boats because the salt would not corrode the Sunderland airplanes, where they would, if you loaded a bunch of salt in a C-47, it would corrode and destroy the shell of the plane. But these planes were able to deliver salt. So, and they would land in Lake Fonzie. So it was really getting down. It was delivering, about 1,000 tons a day on average in July 1948. That's getting there. That's getting towards the 4,500 tons a day. And Truman then makes a really smart decision, and he brings in this guy, General William Tunner, to take overall command of the airlift. He is the only person in the world at the time who had ever commanded an airlift before. He had been in charge of the World War II effort to supply the Chinese nationalists from India and Burma over the hump, over the Himalayas, if you've ever heard of that. The CBI, the China-Burma-India Theater, where airplanes would be supplying the communists over the Himalaya mountains. Very dangerous operation. Tunner was in charge of that, and he had successfully overseen that. So he was brought in. He was a very tough customer. He was brought in to get the airlift in shape, and he did it. He really did it. He systematized it. He was, by early August, planes are departing about every 3 minutes. He's moving the airlift up to almost the 4,500 tons a day that you need, and then Black Friday happened. Black Friday was one of those cold, rainy, low cloud cover days. The flights weren't going well because the weather was so bad. One C-54 crashed at Tempelhof Airport in West Berlin. A second plane going to land after it then crashed because it was trying to avoid the first crash. A third plane then came down and landed on the wrong runway. It was mayhem, and because so many planes were taking off and trying to land, there were dozens of planes that were circling the air over Tempelhof, from 3,000 feet to 12,000 feet. And Tunner himself was on one of those planes. And he saw what was happening down at the tarmac at Tempelhof. And he radioed the control tower. This is like legendary in the Air Force. And he told the air traffic controllers at Tempelhof to be quiet. And he said, I will untangle this. And it took him hours up in the air to order planes in, to order the runways clear. And it was Tunner himself who finally was able to clear the problem. People were killed, people were hurt. And to Tunner, this emphasized that the airlift was not a matter of just kind of improving efficiencies, that this thing needed to be renovated entirely, remade entirely. There needed to be a whole new set of rules for this operation if it was going to be safe, sustainable, and if it was going to be able to deliver the supplies that this city needed to survive. And so he went back, and within a few days came up with the Tunner program, or the Tunner plan, to reshape the airlift. And man, the pilots who were a part of this were not happy, because it meant instrument flying only, not visual. Instrument flying is much more accurate, much quicker, but it's harder. There would be no stacking, as you're waiting to clear. You would take off, and you would land. If there was not a clear runway, the minute that you were supposed to land, you would return to your original base. I mean, this thing was going to be like clockwork. Planes were going to leave every 3 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They were going to take off in groups of 4. Each plane would be 500 feet above the next one behind it. That would take off 3 minutes later. Planes would land 1 per minute. Round the clock, 1,440 landings per day. That just is the same number of minutes in 24 hours. So this was going to be a precision operation. These planes were going to be permitted maybe 30 minutes on the ground, at most, to unload, which meant that the pilots and the co-pilots could not get out of the planes. Nothing pilots love better than getting out of the plane wandering over to the coffee shop, getting a cup of coffee, talking to the pretty Fraulines, you know, and then wandering back to their plane. They were now not permitted to leave the plane. And there was a lot of grumbling about this. And so what Tunner did, and it was very smart, he created these mobile snack shacks with Fraulines delivering the coffee and the donuts to the pilots in the plane. They were okay with that. Very controversial, he hired teams of German former Luftwaffe mechanics, German Air Force mechanics, guys who were still wearing their uniforms from World War II, guys who had, you know, served, fought in the German military against the Allies. He was hiring the mechanics to take care of the planes, because these airplanes were beaten to death. You know, when you fill up a C-47 or a C-54 with coal, that coal dust gets in everything. It needs major cleaning every 25 hours. It needs kind of a deep cleaning and repair every 100 hours. And then every 1,000 hours, huge amounts of components of each plane needs to be replaced. So these planes are constantly need a huge army in itself just to maintain them. And he hires German mechanics who are known for being good to clean and to maintain the airplanes, and he pays them good wages for it. This was unpopular at first because the end of World War II was still so fresh. And most of these pilots had fought in World War II. And they didn't like the idea of Germans maintaining the planes that they were going to be flying. There was concern about sabotage. They were quickly won over, however, when they found that the Germans were completely reliable and loyal and able to be trusted. So by August 31st, there were 1,500 flights a day on average, and the average daily delivery was 4,500 tons of supplies. The Soviets couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe it. Stalin, I think, thought that the Americans were nuts. He thought Truman was an idiot. Why would Truman stick his neck out to save a city that doesn't matter? Half a city that doesn't matter, you know? Didn't quite understand it. The Soviets tried a lot of different tricks, short of shooting planes down, to harm the airlift. They flashed lights in the eyes of the pilots. They conducted anti-aircraft artillery exercises right near the same corridor as the flights. They had Yak, these Soviet fighters, kind of buzz, you know, the supply planes. They once dropped Soviet paratroopers right in front of the planes. So the planes had to go around them. Those poor paratroopers. So, you know, everything they could to disrupt the airlift. And they also tried to win over the residents of West Berlin by promising them food. You know, if you decide to join the East, you will get a ration card. And the ration card will entitle you to 2,000 calories a day. This was quite tempting to the people of Berlin. I don't know if a single one of the 2 million residents of West Berlin accepted the offer. West Berlin, the solidarity from what I've read, and I think Byrne might correct me on this. From what I've read, the solidarity among West Berliners was so strong that they were absolutely not going to accept the Soviet offer of a ration card. They were going to hold out for freedom. And they held a huge rally. It was called Freedom Rally on September 9th, 1948. The mayor of Berlin, Mayor Ernst Reuter, gave a speech to 500,000 people. And it was a speech really aimed not only at the German people to boost the morale of West Berliners, but also very clearly aimed at the American public. He was speaking to the American people. Support this effort. Don't let us die. He said, you cannot abandon the city and its people. This was a moving moment ahead of the 1948 election, and it did help to galvanize American public opinion in support of the airlift, and I would say in support of Truman's re-election in 1948. I have to take a break to talk about this man who is one of all the thousands of veterans who I've gotten to know over the past 17 years with the Veterans Breakfast Club, of all the wonderful, heroic people I've met, Gail Halverson might be my favorite veteran I ever met. And I got to speak with him and interview him. He came on our program, our Veterans Breakfast Club program. I had known about him, contacted his daughter, asked if we could get this 101-year-old former pilot onto our program, and he was delighted to. He flew in the Berlin Airlift, but he didn't just fly in the Berlin Airlift. He did something remarkable, and he told his story on our Veterans Breakfast Club program. You can go on YouTube and watch it. He said his first flight, he was activated for the airlift July 18th, 1948. I asked him, were you upset? Because he had fought in World War II. These guys are being recalled to fly again. He said, oh, not really, because my wife left me, so I was happy to do something else. He arrived, flew his first mission into Tempelhof in July 18, 1948. This is before the Tunner Plan was instituted. He got out of his plane, and he said he saw this band of kids, like you can almost picture it, at the fence near the runway on the other side. He'd never seen a more ragged group of skinny kids, you know, from this high down to this high, completely quiet. And he said, when have you ever seen a group of kids quiet? And they were just staring at him, staring at the goods, the supplies being loaded off the planes. And Halverson went over to them, and they spoke in English. And he said, I wanted to give them something, and I searched my pockets, and all I had was one stick of gum. So I stuck the stick of gum through the chain link, and the biggest kid took it, opened up the wrapper, and very carefully sliced this one stick of gum into 15 pieces so that each kid could have one little piece. And then he said, I'll never forget this, he said, and then they passed the wrapper one to the other to sniff it. And he talked to the kids, and he said, I'll bring more candy next time. And they said, well, how are we going to know it's you when you bring candy? And he said, I'll wiggle my wings as I'm approaching. And so the next time, he said, sure enough, like the next flight, there weren't 15 kids, there were 150 kids. And he wiggled his wings, he had brought all his candy with him, and the demand got so great that he couldn't carry all the candy with him outside the plane, so he went back. This is a picture of him, the candy bomber he became known as. He went back and he prepared these packets. He collected all the chocolate, all the candy he could from his American Air Base in West Germany, and he bundled them up into little sacks. He fashioned little parachutes out of handkerchiefs, and when he went over West Berlin, he threw them out the window, you know? And kids started writing to him and saying, hey, thank you for the candy. My sister didn't get any. We have a red roof and a chicken coop in our yard. You can't miss it as you're approaching Tempelhof, you know, if you can. I mean, it was just absolutely fantastic what he did. And he did it for quite a while, day after day, quietly. And he tells this beautiful story on our program. He said, and then my squadron commander found out what I was doing and chewed me out with every obscenity you could imagine. What the hell are you doing? You're going to cause a riot down there, you know. And he said, I'm going to report you to Tunner, Major General William Tunner. And Halverson said, sure enough, Tunner called him in. And he went into Tunner's office. And Halverson said, I hoped that I would get, I knew I was going to get busted, probably in rank. I hoped that it wasn't going to be like a court-martial or anything. And he said, Tunner, he stood at attention, and Tunner said, are you the pilot who's throwing candy out the window to the kids? And he said, yes. And Tunner said, how do you do it? We should get everybody to do that. He said, it's genius. He said, Tunner told Halverson later, he said, you came up with the single greatest piece of international publicity for the Americans ever created. I mean, you know, everybody in Berlin knows about the candy bomber. And it just emphasizes we're helping kids. You know, this is a humanitarian effort. This is an effort of generosity. And so Tunner ordered that the pilots prepare candy and throw it out the windows. 32 tons of candy were dropped on Berlin during the Berlin Airlift. 32 tons of candy. Letters were sent like this: "Dear American pilots." You could see this little girl struggling with her English. "There was much joy when our teacher told us that we could visit the airport today. Night and day you bring us food and coal with your planes. If you would not bring us food through the air, we would all have nothing to eat. I am sure that there will be trouble sometimes, and some American pilots have lost their lives in order to care for us. I thank you very much for your help and remain with the best wishes for you." And this is very typical. These pilots were just flooded with letters from children. Here is Gail on our program on Zoom, and with him I managed to read about, and I contacted a woman in Missouri, Independence, Missouri, she lives. Her name is Dagmar Weiss. She was a child, like Bern in Berlin. She was a child who picked up one of these things of candy. She had a horrific story of surviving the war. And she said it's hard to describe what that candy meant to her and to her family. That obviously, she said, I mean, we hadn't seen candy in 9 years. We didn't know what candy was. But the world was so dark for so long. And this is like a sliver of hope, a sliver of life. And she said, I've lived a long life, but I've always loved Gail Halverson more than anybody, probably even than my 2 husbands. And they know that. And she wrote this book, Uncle Wiggly Wings, My Love and Admiration for Berlin's Candy Bomber. And it was just like the highlight, one of the highlights of my work with the Veterans Breakfast Club, having the 2 of them on together, and her sharing her memories and him sharing his memories. And then when he died in 2022, I got a call from Dagmar, and she just left a message saying, I lost a friend and my hero, and the world has lost one of the greatest spirits, ever to walk the earth. It was just wonderful. And Gail really was, because Gail not only, of course, did this act, but he lived such an exemplary life afterwards. He said this. He said a lot of things, but one thing that he said, I fought in World War II, and I thought I understood what freedom was. But those kids taught me I did not know what freedom was. Because you only know what freedom really is when it's taken away from you, or when it's threatened. And I looked into the eyes of those kids, and I saw kids who wanted desperately to be free. And it's something that I'll always remember. And then he also said, my experience on the airlift taught me that gratitude, hope, and service before self can bring happiness to the soul when the opposite brings despair. Oh, what a great man he was. But the winter of 48, 49 was really tough. Bad weather, a lot of days that didn't meet the 4,500 tons level. There was one day in November, I think, that only one plane landed at Tempelhof in West Berlin. There were a lot of crashes in that winter because of the bad weather. Bern and I might debate the number of air crew killed in the Berlin Airlift. The number that I found is 70, about half Americans and half British. 39 British, 31 Americans, 25 planes crashed. There's a memorial at Tempelhof. There's a memorial to the airlift in Germany today. Right there, you can see it. And I love this. I don't know if you can see this closely enough, but this is a great cartoon of pilots in the air. This was brutal service for the pilots. They're flying around the clock. So you have this fresh replacement coming in, all happy and bright and clean shaven. He gets a little nervous after the first month, starts sweating after the second month. 3rd month, he's a wreck. And then finally, 6th month, he's, becomes like a near monster. And then he's rotated back home and he's okay again. This was stressful, dangerous work. And it took its toll on the pilots who flew them. After the awful winter, the spring broke warm and clear, and Tunner decided to do a demonstration event for Easter Sunday. For 24 hours, he was going to try and break the record and land 13,000 tons in one day. And they did it. They did it. The Easter operation, 1,383 flights, so more than one per minute, landed in West Berlin, and the tonnage equaled almost 13,000 tons. This broke the airlift. We do know now that Stalin saw this stunt for Easter Sunday, and he said, you know what, these crazy allies are going to keep this up. Let's move on. What's the point of keeping the blockade up? And he announced on May 12th that the blockade would be brought down. And that's really when the airlift ended. The history books will tell you that the airlift did continue until September, and that's because the Allies did continue to fly in supplies because they were afraid that Stalin would change his mind. But over the course of the summer of 1949, it became clear that Stalin would not change his mind. The airlift was over. And this was cause for a big celebration. You know, Lucius Clay was given a ticker tape parade in New York City, and he retired. It was really one of the unambiguous, as I said, victories of the Cold War. Stalin gained nothing by his blockade. Nothing. The U.S. won the prestige, you know, of Western Europe, won the esteem and the admiration and the love, in many cases, of Western Europeans for decades. The totals are impressive: 2.5 million tons of supplies, 280,000 flights were flown, 92,000 million miles. Somebody said the same distance as the Earth to the Sun. And it was very expensive, $5 billion, split between the US, Britain, and West Germany. But it was a cause for celebration, but man, celebration was short-lived. Because immediately after, what the airlift taught both sides was that this was a war. There would be no rapprochement. There would be no agreement between the Soviets and the US. And in fact, Germany would never come back together. 11 days after the end of the airlift, 11 days, the Federal Republic of Germany was created, and the Democratic Republic of Germany was created. So West Germany became its own state, East Germany became its own state. And that division, thank you so much, Colleen, that decision was mirrored in Europe as a whole. NATO was born shortly after the end of the airlift to bring together the Western Allies, and the Warsaw Pact was created in Eastern Europe. On August 29, 1949, the Soviets announced that they had detonated an atomic bomb. This is at the end of the airlift. Just a couple months later, one month later, just about, the communists gained power over China. This is a bad turn for the Cold War. And then, just 6 months after that or so, North Korea invades South Korea, beginning the Korean War. So the Cold War enters a whole new, very violent phase, and the airlift then gets kind of quickly forgotten as we enter this more dangerous phase. But I'm interested, and that's the end of my story, but I'm interested, you could applaud. The applause just serves as a transition to another part of my talk. And I just want to ask Bern, Bern, would you mind standing up? I'm sorry. Yeah, I know, you're going to punch me out. Bern is 90 years old. I shook his hand. He's 90.
A few months only.
Okay, so you're 90 in a few months. You almost broke my hand when you shook it. Did you get any candy from the candy bar?
No, I didn't live in Berlin that time.
Okay.
My parents escaped to south of Germany, French sector.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
But do you remember the Berlin Airlift?
Absolutely. At that time there was, of course, no television.
Yeah.
So we got the news by radio, and every day the newspaper.
Yeah.
And nearly every day we had thinking it's a Berlin Airlift,
Yeah.
because it was unbelievable what the United States were able to do.
Were you in Berlin during the war? Are you from Berlin originally?
Not, fortunately, not during the war.
Okay.
No.
How devastated was Germany after the war? How poor was Germany?
Yeah, you cannot imagine that.
You can imagine.
No, you cannot. You have shown wonderful examples
Yeah.
for destruction.
Yeah.
So it was, very successful for the United States and Great Britain.
Were you afraid of the Soviets taking over Germany?
Oh yes. Yes, but we felt very safe because the United States had been so powerful. And we always thought that will not happen.
I'm going to ask you a tough question. Did you ever wonder, you were 13 during the airlift? 13 years old?
Yeah, 48.
1948. Did you ever wonder if you were going to die? If you were going to make it?
No, many times.
Many times.
During war.
During the war.
Yeah. We were told that we all would be killed when we would lose the war.
Yeah.
That was a strategy what they
Right.
did with the population.
Thank you so much, Bern. Thank you for coming.
I would like to tell you that, of course, there comes the moment when the war ends that the so-called enemy would come to you. And that day we lived in the house of my grandparents because there we were relatively safe. It was a village out of towns. And then American soldiers came in our house.
Yeah.
And I never forgot in my life, they gave me candy. Unbelievable, yeah. But that was the middle of Germany, you have seen the map.
Yeah.
And only about 6 weeks later, our part where we lived was given to the Russians.
Oh, jeez.
Yes. But the war had ended, fortunately, when the Russian came. And the Russian made it very easy in that village. They announced, this is the main road, all the population living there has to go here. And our troops will be there without German people, and
Yeah.
the German people will be here.
Right.
That's what they did.
Wow.
Yeah. Very, very easy.
So you lived in this sector down here,
Yeah,
the the southwest.
in the French zone, yeah.
And where were you from? Where were you during the war?
I was here,
You were right in the middle.
yeah, right in the...
Oh boy. So you were in what would become East Germany.
Yeah.
Ah.
My first language in high school was Russian,
Oh wow.
of course. And then when I came to south of Germany, to the French sector, the next language was French. And therefore, I love French language. Yes.
Thank you, Bern. Bern Stoy. Thank you very much. Does anybody have questions or comments or rebuttals? Yes, Karen.
Back in 1966, I had a girlfriend that was an exchange student in Sharp Valley. And we became very good friends. And in 1966, we went to, another friend and myself, we went on a trip around Europe. And we went as far as Vienna, where she lived.
Yeah.
And They took us, and this is 1966, they took us outside of Vienna and they showed us a spot where the Russians still had a wall, a fence with the guns on around the top.
Yeah.
And that was in 1966.
Yeah.
Now, why were they still there, or what, when did they leave that part?
Hey, let's ask Bern. Yeah, the Soviets liberated Austria. The Soviets occupied Austria. And then they gave it up, or gave up part of it. I don't know if you know or remember, because I do not, what parts of Austria the Soviets remained in after World War II?
Vienna itself, they had nothing.
No, yeah, they had,
It's just right outside, and here's this big wall.
Right.
Barricaded wall with the guns.
yeah, I don't know the history of that, unfortunately.
I never learned it, because it just was,
You should have learned it.
I know.
You were there. Yeah,
But they were so glad that they were on the other side.
on the other side, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, Gary.
Considering what happened to Germany after World War I, with the way it was suppressed, everything, the economy was suppressed, why was there so much enthusiasm for the Morgenthau Plan, which was going to do basically the same thing?
Okay, this is a great question. After World War I, of course, the Treaty of Versailles devastated Germany. Devastated Germany. But it didn't devastate it enough. Somebody said, like, the Versailles Treaty after World War I was just like the anti-Goldilocks solution. It was like, it wasn't hard enough on Germany to make sure that it would never rise again. But it wasn't easy enough on Germany to ensure that the German people wouldn't bear this deep resentment toward the Allies. It was right at that sour spot that pissed off the Germans, made them poor, but also gave them an opportunity to rise up again. The Morgenthau Plan was intended to be so devastating, so punitive, that Germany would never have a chance to emerge again. That was the idea. Is that about right?
Yes,
Bert?
absolutely.
Okay. All right, thank you very much.